Looks like we're live. Welcome to my first Q&A live stream thingy. I still haven't worked out all of the quirks and details with the tech that I have available, so hopefully it's not overly laggy or we don't get shut off or anything like that. Keep in mind that this is still very much an experiment for me, so if this works out, maybe I'll try to slip it into my schedule here and there a little bit more often. But I wanted to jump into some of your questions. So if you have a question, please write it down. Make sure to leave an actual question mark at the end, so I know it's a question. If I don't see a question mark, I'm just going to assume it's a statement and may not address it. So just to start off, if you're new to my stuff, my name is Wesley Huff. I work as a speaker and writer and researcher with Ultimate Questions, which is an apologetics initiative of a ministry called Power to Change Canada. And it's a student ministry here in Canada where I live. I'm in Toronto. And I'm also an associate with Apologetics Canada, and I'm currently a PhD student in biblical studies here at the University of Toronto. So I hope that for people who are new, that gives you a little bit of a background as to who I am. So let's jump into these. The first question I see is, hey Wes, in light of the church's current stance on marriage, how do you justify Old Testament polygamy? So starting off with the easy ones. Well, I guess my answer is that I don't justify it in the sense of the actual definition of what the word justify means. I mean, if justify or to justify something entails showing or proving something to be right or reasonable, then I don't think polygamy is right or reasonable. But let's talk about what we see going on in the Old Testament regarding all of that, because I think this is at times something that's confusing for a lot of Christians. I know my Muslim friends certainly point to instances of polygamy in the Old Testament as justification for why it is not only pardonable but preferable within Islam. So let me put it like this. The first time we see polygamy comes up in Genesis 4, and it's a pretty shady context anyways, because it's a murderer who's doing it. And the next time it comes up, Abraham is doubting God's promises, and he tries to take things into his own hands, which just results in a lot of pretty serious family conflict. The next instance, I believe, is Jacob tricking his father and then is shortly tricked by his own father-in-law, which results in a polygamous marriage which Jacob never wanted to begin with, the kids of which we see the whole debacle with them trying to murder their brother their brother Joseph. So some pretty clear chaos right there. And that's followed up by more examples of chaos within instances of it happening with David and then again with Solomon. So basically the moral of the story is this. Whenever we see an instance of polygamy, it's descriptive, not prescriptive. In other words, God had a plan, an intention, and Jesus himself says in Matthew 19:4, he quotes from Genesis, he says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and for this reason a man will leave his mother and father and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." He's quoting Genesis 1, chapter 27 there. So God's plan is clear and unequivocal, and I would contend that's monogamy. That is what is prescribed. And when we see instances of polygamy, it's not God prescribing that should happen, but describing what ends up happening in a broken world with broken people. And every instance we can point to of it happening leads to chaos and brokenness. So to sum it all up, polygamy was not God's intention. I think God permits it in certain circumstances to show the individuals partaking in the practice their own brokenness, knowing that nothing good will come of it, and it will show pretty clearly that moving away from God does what God does prescribe for our good will result in chaos. I think God permits these types of things and uses them teach us and to teach the individuals we're talking about lessons. And all the examples that we can read about in the Old Testament clearly show us that it's bad news bears and not what God planned, and causes a whole lot of chaos. Okay, let's look at some other questions. Here's a good one that I can speak to. This person asks, what's with the ending of Mark? And in brackets, he has 16:9 to 20. So to make it as simple as possible for the sake of time, what we're seeing here is the fact that Mark 16:9 through 20 is absent from some of our best Greek manuscript witnesses. You get to Mark 16 verse 8, and there's simply no more in these earliest manuscripts that we have. Now, that is pretty significant. The fact that it's missing from our earliest Christian texts. Now, let me preface that by saying it's in hundreds and hundreds of others, but when we're talking about textual criticism, it's the absences that make the most interesting investigations. What else can I say? Well, along with that fact, that it's absent from the earliest copies of this section, starting at verse 9 and following of chapter 16, the text doesn't look anything like the style we've seen of Mark leading up to that point. So if Mark did write this longer ending of his gospel, then he's just decided to change his style completely at the very last minute. And this kind of stuff leads the vast majority of New Testament scholars to conclude that the last bit of the authentic part of Mark's gospel ends at chapter 16, verse 8. Now, let me say that those who do hold to that position differ about why it ends there specifically. And this is an interesting conversation. So for a while there, it was thought that even though New Testament scholars were convinced that the longer ending was later, they thought that the original ending had been lost. I actually know a few scholars who hold this position, that somewhere in the earliest period of the copying, the rest of the resurrection story had just been torn out of some of those early copies, and it just didn't continue on in the copying process, which really isn't that crazy of a theory if you think about it, especially if this was originally written on a scroll. It's not unreasonable to think that that could have happened. That kind of stuff happens in other instances with other ancient texts. And one of the clearest evidences for this theory is that the last word of verse 8 in English is translated, for they were afraid, afraid being the last word in the sentence. But in Greek, the last word in the sentence is for. The phrase is ephbonta gar. Greek, of course, not being like English, where word order is pretty important. You can have things arranged the other way around in Greek. It's like that in some other languages too. German, for example. Word order isn't as important. But even in Greek, this is a little bit odd. It's like ending not only a sentence, or even better, ending an entire book with the word and. It's just strange. So some scholars concluded that it's just too unlikely that Mark would have ended his gospel in such an awkward way. That's the conclusion that they come to. But there is Oxford scholar Robert Lightfoot who wrote an article, I think it was in the 90s, although I could be wrong about that, where he makes some pretty strong, he makes a pretty strong case that it makes perfect sense for Mark to end with the word for. He actually argues that grammatically it's okay. It's not the best way to end things, but it's not completely erroneous to do so. And that's an interesting argument. But it was scholar Clayton Croy, actually, who wrote a book called The Mutilation of Mark's Gospel. I think it was back in 2003, and brought back this idea that Mark's Gospel was longer, and we've actually just lost the rest of it. So there is that theory. Other people think that Mark was just a little bit dramatic, a bit of a suspenseful genius, and ended his gospel account very abruptly and sort of with this sense of mystery and expectation. I think the New English translation does a good job of translating this section like that. So the translation committee has the text rendered as, I used to have it memorized. Then they went out and ran from the tomb, for terror and bewilderment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That's how the NET translation renders it. And ending things off very dark and dramatic. And I'm actually sympathetic to this theory because I don't think that the longer ending is original based on the manuscript tradition. I think the evidence bears out that it was a later addition, whether an attempt to rectify the abruptness of Mark's ending or an embarrassment that it says the women didn't tell anything to anyone. I mean, obviously they did tell someone because it eventually gets around to Mark. And the early church father Papias, however you want to say it, tells us that Mark became the interpreter of Peter and wrote down what Peter remembered. So I think it makes more sense to read that as the women didn't tell anything to anyone until they go to the apostles. That's how I would read it. In other words, they didn't go around ranting and raving to just anyone. They kept it to themselves and made sure to tell Jesus' inner circle specifically. And I think that makes sense with what the other Gospels describe as well. I think if we see Scripture as a whole, that makes sense. The synoptic scholar, or at least he started as a synoptic scholar. He's definitely moved on to other endeavors. But for the arguments, for the sake of argument, let's call him that. The scholar Mark Goodacre, he makes an interesting observation when he talks about this subject by highlighting that maybe Mark was simply content with it being a bit of a cliffhanger, with ending in that sort of a abrupt way. And so he talks about other works of art that have been left unfinished, such as Schubert's Symphony No. 8, because Schubert ended it without a true finish, and it's not like he died or anything. In fact, there is a Symphony No. 9 in the lineup. And Goodacre proposes that this idea that Mark didn't truly know a good way to end everything is plausible. And the stories of the resurrected Jesus were still in the living memory of the eyewitnesses, and so those narratives were circulating. And there's this cliffhanger ending because it's a bit of an invitation for others to actually fill in the conclusion with their own remembrances or traditions about what happens next. And Goodacre actually thinks that what Matthew and Luke then do with their use of Mark's content and further elaboration in their own gospel biographies, that's what they're doing, as well as the further scribes in later decades that fill in what eventually makes its way into the manuscript tradition as what we now know as chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, the longer ending. I've also heard it theorized that Mark's gospel is actually written as a prequel to the creed that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15. There it says that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised according to the scriptures. And then it goes on to list people that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then to more than 500, and then to James, and then to all of the apostles, it says. So Paul's letter predates the Gospels, not in content, but in their writing. And if Paul is right that this is known around the churches more generally as something that he himself then repeated as of first importance, the idea that Mark is writing the prequel to all of that is an interesting one. And if you think about it, the actions of Mark 16 ends where 1 Corinthians 15 picks up. Because in 1 Corinthians 15, it starts off the eyewitness list by saying, and he appeared to Cephas, that's Peter. And that's a bit, and that bit we specifically don't have in Mark. There's a prophecy of Jesus appearing to Peter, but no more. So maybe Mark is writing this as a prequel, and there's no need to keep carrying on because the early Christians could just fill in the gaps where the common understanding within the oral tradition of the early Jesus communities of what happens picks up. That's an interesting theory, which is, yeah, it's just a cool thing to think about, I think. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I think the reason we see that the original ending of Mark stops there at verse 8 gives us a lot of confidence in the text of Scripture. I know a lot of people want to point out that differences in the manuscripts, which lead to citation notes at the bottom of the page in our modern Bibles, is problematic. But I truly think that that's not the case. I think the transparency we have in the text of the Bible is second to none. And that it's because of the wealth of information that we do have that we can have an incredible level of trust in the text to understand what the original authors wrote and what was added in at a later time. Therefore, it's because of the evidence that we know what the original authors wrote, not in spite of it. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, I probably took too much time on that question already. But I hope that helps in sort of the question of the longer ending of Mark. Here's an interesting question. How do you think we can combat liberal theology creeping more and more into the church? I think it depends on what we're defining as liberal theology, if that makes any sense. So traditionally, liberalism is what Richard Niebuhr described as a God without wrath, bringing men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. And Niebuhr wrote that in the 1930s, but I think it still applies today. I also think we need to be careful not to unnecessarily label a group or a person as a liberal or even a conservative or what have you, if it truly doesn't apply. It's kind of like how you see a lot of people in social media and calling other people Nazis for silly things when those people clearly aren't Nazis. And I think what that does is it waters down when actual instances of those things, of like neo-Nazis, rear their ugly head. Not that I'm equating theological liberalism with Nazism. I'm just using that as an example. Please don't take that out of context. Post it somewhere. But to get back to the question, I think one of the things that often goes unrecognized is that liberal theology is often a movement to rescue Christianity from perceived embarrassment. Now, what do I mean by that? I think what we can see from legitimate liberal theological liberalism is a movement that sees themselves as saving the Bible or Christianity from embarrassment. So, if we can have a Christianity that explains away the difficult texts and sidelines them, then they see that as they see that as a better means to invite people to come to Christ. I think if you look at the first generations of what eventually becomes what we can refer to as theological liberalism, it's people who genuinely want others to come to Christ, and they sincerely believe that this is the best way to do that. I know that that sort of definition or explanation might surprise people. And the way people sometimes get seduced into abandoning scriptural authority is when they become persuaded by ideas that more people are going to come to Christ if this thing or that thing or the other thing that I'm uncomfortable with is somehow like watered down or eliminated. And sometimes people are persuaded through the means of theological education that they are being more faithful to the text if they read it in a way that is seen as somehow contrary to another text. So then people who have been brought up in, say, a Christian context where they are taught to value the authority of the Bible in like a more conservative context, then they're persuaded that the most honest reading of the text is actually to read it in a way that makes it contradict with another one. I think that that's often very enticing. So in that way, a lot of, maybe not all, but I would contend the majority of what we call liberal theology is a series of, say, rescue attempts to rescue Christianity itself. So historically, in this conversation, you have theologians like German theologian and philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was looking at the rest of the theological intellectuals of his day, like the 1800s, and seeing scholars in Germany leave Christianity in droves. And significantly impacted by the Enlightenment and postmodern thinking. So Schleiermacher thought that Christianity had to change in order to survive. If you read his stuff, I think that's clear. And he wasn't sitting around thinking about how to destroy Christianity. He was actually attempting to make it more palatable to the society around him with an actual apologetic and missionary perspective. That is, I think he thought the way to reach the culture, and this was the way to reach the culture. And so it wasn't his purpose to undercut the central message of the gospel, but I think that is in fact what ends up happening. And so in a very short time, you get exactly what Niebuhr talks about: a God without wrath, bringing men without sin into a kingdom without God, into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. If there's one thing we can say about identifying true theological liberalism, it is an undercurrent of saying that the 2,000-year message of Christianity must change in order for Christianity to survive and effectively engage in the culture. Actually, folks, I apologize. I'm actually getting a notification on the software I'm using that the camera I'm using as a webcam is going to die on me. So I'm going to wrap this up. And I apologize for those who asked questions that I didn't get around to answer. Maybe I'll go back and look at the comment feeds and try to pick some of those up later and do another video maybe. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and hopefully some of this has been helpful. It's a bit of an experiment for me. I'm just trying some things out. So otherwise, stay safe, everyone. Thanks for watching.